Who raised you more? Your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
It started with my sister looking straight at me, not even flinching, and telling me I wasn't ready to sit with the family yet, and while the words probably sound harmless on their own, they cut deeper than she probably realized. Because in that moment it wasn't just about a seat at a dinner table, it was about years of being treated like I was somehow still a kid in their eyes, someone who hadn't earned the right to be included, and I stood there with this mix of anger and embarrassment bubbling up, thinking how ridiculous it was that I could work as hard as I had, go through what I went through, and still be seen as the one who just didn't belong. You know that kind of silence where you almost hear yourself breathing louder than normal, and you want to argue back, but you know it won't matter, because the person standing in front of you has already decided what you are in their head, and nothing you say will change it? That's where I was. I could have told her exactly what I was working on, how close I was to something that would change everything, but I had learned a long time ago that when people don't believe in you, explaining yourself only makes you look desperate, so instead I just nodded, walked out of the room, and let them have their perfect little dinner without me. It's not like this was the first time either. My sister, Claire, has always had this way of acting like she's the gatekeeper of the family, as if she gets to decide who's serious and who's not, who deserves respect and who's still stuck in the learning phase, and while my parents never said it out loud, they let her play that role, which meant I always felt like I was one step behind no matter how old I got. They'd ask about her career, about her new house, about her husband's promotions, and when it came to me, the questions were lighter, more like filler to make sure I wasn't left out completely, but never the kind that showed they believed I was on her level. I can't lie, part of me wanted to scream that night. I wanted to stand in the doorway and tell them that while they were carving up turkey and pouring wine, I had been carving out something that didn't just matter for me, but was about to change the game for an entire industry. But I swallowed it, because I knew if I said anything, they would look at me the way they always did, with that polite smile that said, "Sure, maybe one day." I hated that smile more than the words. So I left. I didn't slam the door, I didn't make a scene, I just went home to my quiet apartment, the one nobody in my family had ever even visited because they didn't think it was worth the drive. I dropped my bag, turned on the TV mostly for background noise, and sat there replaying her words in my head, wondering why after all these years they still had the power to get under my skin. Maybe it's because no matter how independent you think you are, part of you still craves that recognition from the people who raised you, from the ones who are supposed to be proud. I was half listening to the news when I heard my own name, and I froze. For a second I thought I had imagined it, because why would a national anchor be saying my name on a night like this? But then I heard it again, loud and clear, tied to the deal that had just closed. The one I had been building quietly for years while they all assumed I was wasting my time. They were saying my company had broken records, that it was the largest deal of its kind ever announced, and suddenly I was sitting there alone, staring at the TV, with my heart racing in a way I didn't even know it could. And I swear, in that moment, all I could think about was how just a few hours earlier my sister told me I wasn't ready to sit with them, but here I was, being talked about on national news like someone who had just shifted the playing field. I didn't cheer, I didn't cry, I didn't even call anyone. I just sat there, stunned, realizing that my whole world had changed in the span of a few minutes, and they had no idea yet. That was the exact moment I decided I wasn't going to hand them the story, I wasn't going to call or text, I wasn't even going to brag. I was going to let them find out the way everyone else did, through a screen, through the same TV where I had just watched them dismiss me. And I knew when they did, the balance of everything between us would never look the same again. I barely slept that night, not because I was replaying the dinner that never happened or the way Claire had so confidently told me I wasn't ready to sit with them, but because I kept hearing my name on loop. Not in her condescending voice, but in the crisp tone of the news anchor announcing that my deal had just shattered every record in the industry, and I found myself sitting on my couch long after midnight, staring at my phone as messages began to stack up from people I hadn't heard from in Years, colleagues congratulating me, acquaintances suddenly remembering I existed, and even competitors who couldn't hide their shock. And it was in that strange blur of recognition that I realized how much my family's indifference had shaped me. How I had built this enormous achievement in silence, almost in rebellion, as if I had to prove to them by sheer force that I was worth more than the scraps of attention they had always thrown my way. The funny part is, I didn't feel like celebrating, not in the way people assume you would when your name suddenly flashes across national headlines, because the truth is I had already celebrated quietly months earlier when I knew the deal was locked in. And by the time it was finalized, I was too tired to throw confetti in the air, too drained from years of sleepless nights and endless calls and late meetings, and what I felt now was not euphoria, but this heavy wave of vindication, the kind of deep satisfaction that comes not from applause, but from finally seeing the scoreboard light up after everyone told you the game was out of your league. As the anchors went on and analysts debated what this meant for the market, I thought back to all the times my parents asked me why I didn't just get a steady job like Claire, why I risked so much instead of taking the path everyone else followed. And I could practically hear my mother's sighs, the ones she gave me whenever I said I was fine and didn't need money, the sighs that carried disappointment more than concern, as though choosing to build something of my own was a stubborn phase I would outgrow. And yet here I was, my stubbornness broadcast as brilliance to millions of viewers while they passed around dessert without me. I scrolled through the notifications, and I saw names from high school, from college, people who once rolled their eyes at my ideas or politely avoided investing when I had quietly pitched, and now they were writing things like, "Knew you'd make it," and "So proud to know you." And it was almost comical because I knew they hadn't believed in me at all. They had believed in Claire and in my parents, because that was safer, and now they were scrambling to rewrite history as if they had stood by me from the start. But the digital trail of ignored messages and unanswered emails told a very different story. But the texts that stopped me cold weren't from old friends or distant colleagues, they were from my family, and instead of excitement or congratulations, the tone was guilt-laced, manipulative, and laced with that same patronizing authority I had grown up with. My father wrote that I should have told them earlier because family deserves to know before the world, as if he had earned that privilege by years of looking the other way. My mother, in her polished way, said she was concerned about the sudden attention I would get and that I should be careful not to embarrass the family, as though the worst outcome of my success was how it might reflect on them. And Claire, of course, wrote the longest one, telling me she was happy for me, but that now I would finally understand what real responsibility looked like, as if the work I had done up until now had been some sort of game. And she reminded me that I still had a lot to learn from them, the same people who had never once asked a single serious question about what I was building. I stared at those messages, feeling my jaw tighten, and I realized they didn't see me any differently even now, even after headlines were spelling out the scale of what I had accomplished, because to them I would always be the younger one, the reckless one, the one they assumed needed their permission to graduate into adulthood, and that was when the switch flipped inside me. I decided I wouldn't defend myself, I wouldn't argue or explain or try to make them see me, because they would never see me voluntarily. Instead, I would let reality crash into them, unfiltered, undeniable. The same way it had just crashed into millions of strangers who now knew my name before my own family truly did. I put the phone down, let their words hang unanswered, and sat there listening to another round of analysts on TV arguing about how this deal would reshape everything. And I thought about how strange it was that people who had never met me seemed to grasp the significance more than the people who had raised me. And that silence I left in the group thread, that refusal to feed their need for acknowledgement, was the first small act of revenge, because for once I wasn't running after their approval. I was forcing them to sit with their ignorance, while the rest of the world applauded without them. And as I finally crawled into bed, exhausted and wired at the same time, I knew that the next day would not be normal, because once the family truly realized what this meant, they wouldn't just be sending messages from a distance, they would come to me in person. And for the first time in my life, they would be the ones waiting outside for me instead of the other way around. The next morning, I walked into the lobby of my building expecting to grab a coffee downstairs and maybe skim through the endless stream of congratulatory emails that had piled up overnight, but instead of the quiet routine I normally relied on, I froze at the sight of my entire family sitting there as if they had camped out just to ambush me, and the strangest part wasn't that they were there, but how quickly they had shifted from ignoring me to presenting themselves as supportive relatives, complete with forced smiles and exaggerated warmth that couldn't hide the calculation behind their eyes. Claire was the first to stand, adjusting her tone like she was addressing a colleague at a networking event rather than her sister who, just hours earlier, she had dismissed as not ready to sit at the family table. And she wrapped her words in this syrupy praise about how proud she was, how she always knew I had potential, though every syllable dripped with the insincerity of someone trying to rewrite history on the spot. And I couldn't help but think back to the countless dinners where she had rolled her eyes when I mentioned work, where she had mocked my ideas in front of relatives, where she positioned herself as the golden child while I was relegated to the corner of the conversation. My parents stood close behind her, each offering their own version of congratulation that felt less like genuine acknowledgement and more like a carefully rehearsed performance, as though they had gathered in the car on the way over to align their story. Deciding that the best approach was to act as though they had been supportive all along, and in that moment I realized the sudden urgency wasn't about pride but about control, because my success had caught them off guard and now they were scrambling to re-establish their place in the narrative before the outside world saw the cracks in our family dynamic. I listened quietly, not interrupting, because part of me was fascinated by how quickly human beings can pivot when they feel the ground shift beneath them, and while their mouths formed words of praise, their eyes betrayed something else entirely: fear, greed, and a desperate need to be attached to me now that my name carried weight they could no longer deny. I thought about how, just the night before, Claire had made me feel like a child begging for a seat at the grown-up table, and now she was clinging to me in public as if standing next to me would transfer some of the recognition she had always hoarded for herself. When I finally spoke, I didn't thank them, I didn't even smile. I just asked what they were doing in my lobby at 8 in the morning, and the awkward pause that followed was telling, because the truth was they hadn't come to celebrate me. They had come to stake their claim, to ensure that in the story being written about me they could insert themselves as the wise family who had guided me along, rather than the skeptical, dismissive presence they had always been. My father was the first to fill the silence, saying they wanted to make sure I wasn't overwhelmed, that I needed family around me during times like this, and while he spoke calmly, I could hear the underlying message loud and clear: they weren't here for me. They were here for what being connected to me now meant for them. Claire jumped in again, shifting from false praise to thinly veiled demands, suggesting that now that I was in the big leagues, I would need guidance on how to navigate media, investors, and public appearances, and, of course, she knew people who could help. People I should absolutely meet, all of which sounded less like advice and more like a calculated attempt to wedge herself into my success, as though I needed her permission to operate at this level. And in that moment, I had to stop myself from laughing, because the irony was unbearable. For years she had told me I wasn't ready, that I didn't understand responsibility, and now she was trying to present herself as my advisor. As though I hadn't just orchestrated a deal so large it was literally being dissected on financial networks worldwide. I didn't argue. I didn't correct her. I just nodded slowly, letting her believe she still held the upper hand, because I knew the most effective form of revenge wasn't shouting back in anger, but letting her trap herself in her own arrogance, giving her enough rope to expose just how little she understood about what I had built. My parents, meanwhile, echoed her, talking about how we need to be united as a family now and how the world is watching us, as if the spotlight on me was somehow theirs by extension. And I stood there realizing that the same people who once dismissed me as naive were now terrified of being left out of something they could no longer control. But the real moment that sealed it was when Claire leaned closer, lowered her voice just enough to make it sound conspiratorial, and told me that the next step would be figuring out how I can help you distribute all this new wealth responsibly. Which wasn't a suggestion, but a demand dressed as sisterly guidance, and I felt this sharp clarity settle over me, not anger, not sadness, but a cold awareness that they weren't here to congratulate me at all. They were here to position themselves as beneficiaries, to rewrite their treatment of me into a narrative where they had always been at my side. I didn't confront her right then, though every muscle in my body wanted to, because I knew that patience was the most powerful weapon I had, and if I let them keep talking, if I let them reveal themselves fully, then when I chose to turn the tables it would land with the kind of force they could never recover from. So I simply told them I had a meeting upstairs, that I appreciated their concern, and that we could talk later, and the look on Claire's face was priceless, a mixture of surprise and irritation that I wasn't bending immediately to her plans. As I walked away, leaving them still sitting in the lobby, I knew the real confrontation was coming, and I also knew I would not walk into it unprepared, because this time I wasn't the younger sister begging for a seat, I was the one holding the entire table. And they hadn't yet realized just how completely the balance had shifted. That afternoon I sat in my office, a space my family had never once visited or even asked to see, and I thought about the surreal image of them waiting in my lobby like a group of fans who had suddenly discovered a celebrity lived in their building. Except they weren't fans and they weren't proud. They were opportunists who had come to secure their place before someone else filled it, and that realization left me both angry and oddly calm, because for the first time I understood that the power dynamic had flipped permanently, and whether they admitted it or not, they were no longer in control of how I was seen or treated. For years I had been cast as the outsider, the one who wasn't ready, the one who needed to be taught, guided, and sometimes humored. But that morning showed me that my sister and parents were now circling me not out of love, but out of fear that they had been wrong all along, and that being wrong would cost them more than they were willing to admit. Instead of pushing back or confronting them directly, I decided to lean into silence, to let them believe that their sudden shift from dismissal to celebration was working. Because I knew the most devastating kind of revenge is never loud or aggressive, but calculated and surgical, designed to expose hypocrisy with undeniable clarity. So when Claire called that afternoon, speaking with the kind of forced authority that only she could muster, telling me that we needed to discuss how I was going to handle this new level of responsibility, I didn't argue or laugh or hang up. I told her I wanted the family to come with me to dinner that evening so we could sit together, finally, and talk like adults. The pause on the other end of the line told me she hadn't expected that, and I could almost picture her calculating whether this was her chance to take control of the story again. That night we sat at a table I had reserved at a restaurant they could never have imagined me affording on my own, and while they admired the place and whispered about who else might be there, I let them bask in the illusion that they were still in charge. That this was my way of welcoming them back into my orbit, but underneath the calm I was rehearsing exactly what I was going to say, because this wasn't just about dinner, it was about resetting the balance once and for all. Claire started in first, of course, with her rehearsed lines about how she and my parents could guide me through the chaos and how it was important that I didn't make rash choices because too much money and attention could ruin someone. And she said it in that patronizing tone she always used, as though I were a teenager fumbling through my first job instead of the woman who had just closed a historic deal. I waited until the appetizers were cleared before I responded, and instead of raising my voice or defending myself, I pulled out my phone and read aloud a series of messages from the past few years, Claire telling me I was irresponsible for chasing pipe dreams, my mother advising me to stop wasting my energy and settle down, my father forwarding me job postings for assistant positions as if I should be grateful to apply, and I laid each one on the table like evidence in a trial, my voice calm, deliberate, and impossible to dismiss. Their faces tightened, their smiles cracked, and for the first time I saw the arrogance drain from Claire's posture as she realized I had receipts, undeniable proof of their dismissiveness, their lack of faith, and their repeated efforts to belittle what I was building. They stammered excuses, my mother insisting they had only been concerned, my father claiming he was trying to protect me from disappointment, and Claire, never one to back down, snapping that I was being dramatic and twisting things to make them look bad. But the truth was already on the table, literally, and I didn't need to embellish a single word because the texts spoke for themselves. I leaned back, let the silence hang, and then told them that the reason I had invited them here wasn't to humiliate them, though they deserved it, but to make it clear that from this point on, they had no claim to my success, no right to rewrite the past, and no seat at the table unless I chose to offer one. The irony of using the phrase seat at the table wasn't lost on me, and I watched Claire's jaw tighten as she realized exactly what I meant, that I hadn't forgotten the night before when she told me I wasn't ready, that I hadn't let it slide as a careless comment, and that I had chosen this moment, this dinner, to turn her own words back on her with a force she couldn't deflect. And yet, instead of backing down, she leaned forward and delivered a line that nearly broke my composure, because she told me, with absolute confidence, that sooner or later I would realize I still needed them. That I might be making headlines now, but I didn't know how to manage real power, and that without their guidance, I would eventually collapse. For a moment I sat in stunned silence, because even faced with undeniable evidence of their doubt and dismissal, she still believed she held the authority, and that was when I realized that exposing their hypocrisy wasn't enough. I needed to make a move so sharp and final that they could never again mistake themselves for the gatekeepers of my life. I didn't say it out loud yet, but as I looked at their expectant faces across the table, I knew the next step would not just silence them for the evening, but redefine our relationship forever, and when it landed, they would never see it coming. I walked into that final confrontation knowing that everything I had held back until now was about to come into play, because the truth is revenge isn't about raising your voice or throwing accusations. It's about standing so firmly in your own power that the people who once dismissed you are forced to see themselves reflected in the glass they tried to keep you behind. And as I stepped into the lobby the following morning and saw them all waiting there again, this time with the same stiff smiles, but noticeably more desperation in their eyes, I realized they weren't simply visiting me as family. They were positioning themselves like petitioners, trying to secure access to something they could no longer ignore. And the weight of that irony made me calmer than I had ever been in their presence. Claire began the show again, acting as though she was the spokesperson for the entire family, telling me that after sleeping on it she had come up with a plan, and I had to suppress a laugh because the arrogance of her assuming she could plan my future after years of mocking my ambitions was almost too much to stomach, but I let her talk because every word she spoke tied the noose tighter around the illusion she had built. She laid out her vision of how I should use my new influence, how I could channel it into causes she approved of, how she could connect me with the right people, and how if I was smart, I would listen to the wisdom of those who had lived longer and understood better. And I watched my parents nod along, chiming in at carefully chosen points to remind me that family unity would be crucial now that the world was paying attention. I let them finish, not interrupting, and then I leaned against the reception desk and calmly told them the part they hadn't yet discovered, the detail that had not made the news because it was buried in the paperwork of the deal. And that detail was that the company division Claire had been chasing for years, the same one she had boasted about to relatives, the one she had tried and failed to break into through her husband's connections, was now under my direct control, not as a minor stake or a side note, but as the sole decision-maker with the power to open or close every door she had ever wanted access to. For a moment she didn't process what I was saying, her face still fixed in that patronizing smile, but as the words sank in, her expression cracked, and the silence that followed was sweeter than any headline I could have ever dreamed of. My father tried to recover first, offering some clumsy speech about how this could be a great opportunity for all of us to come together. But his voice carried the strain of a man who realized too late that he had underestimated the very person he was now trying to lean on, and my mother quickly added that she was sure I would do the right thing because family had to come before business. Yet both of them knew they were no longer appealing to a daughter they could dismiss, but to a woman who had no obligation to carry them. I didn't shout, I didn't accuse, I simply told them that while I valued the idea of family, I no longer confused blood with loyalty, and that the doors they were so eager to walk through would remain closed to them. Not out of spite, but because they had proven over and over again that they only wanted in when it suited them. Claire, predictably, broke the silence with a venom she had probably been storing for years, telling me I was ungrateful, that I was rewriting history, that without the family's influence, I would never have reached this point. And in that moment, I didn't even feel anger, I felt pity, because the lie she had lived by, that she was the gatekeeper, the one who decided who was ready and who wasn't, had just been shattered in front of everyone. I leaned closer, kept my voice calm, and reminded her of the night she told me I wasn't ready to sit at the table, and then I told her that not only had I built my own table, but now I was the one deciding who got to sit and who had to stay standing in the lobby. The look on her face, that mix of rage and realization, was the exact closure I didn't know I needed until it happened. I didn't drag it out. I didn't let them argue. I simply turned to leave, and as I walked toward the elevator, I could feel their eyes on me, a silence so heavy it followed me all the way up to my floor. That was the moment I knew the revenge was complete, not because I had humiliated them or screamed for recognition, but because I had forced them to confront a truth they could never spin or erase. I had won, and I had done it without their approval, their guidance, or their belief. The family that once told me I wasn't ready had been left waiting in a lobby they would never be invited to leave, and I stepped into the elevator with the quiet satisfaction of someone who didn't just flip the script, but rewrote the entire story.